Welcome back to Fast Gadgets. So we're rounding out the end of June here and slowly heading into July, and I wanted to talk about two issues. Number one was an update to my computer system using Fedora 25 on the Lenovo Yoga 910, and second is why I don't want more desktop users using Linux. You heard that right. I do not want more desktop users on Linux. And I'm going to explain why in just a minute, but to start off, for those of you who have been following my Fedora 25 boondoggle, now I would say about a month ago, I successfully blew up Fedora, and you can watch my video here and see what exactly was going on. Essentially, the screen was corrupting and flickering repeatedly. So I booted up the computer today and I did some more testing. I tried both Wayland and then Xorg, and it was strange because it didn't seem to matter which one I was using, and I can select Xorg or Wayland in the login. So just before I log in, I get the login screen. I can decide which one I want to use. I thought Wayland was okay. I went into GNOME and I was editing and working, and there was no flickering whatsoever, and then all of a sudden it started flickering again. So I decided to run an update, and today there was another kernel update. Now I kind of had an inkling that it was either a driver issue or a kernel update, because I was seeing issues that were in both Wayland and in Xorg, and the issue being that screen flickering. So I begin to think, maybe this isn't really an issue at all with the delivery of the graphical content, the server part. And I had seen this before on my Lenovo Yoga 2, and it ended up being a power save function call in the kernel. So anyway, I ran another update. I rebooted, and it really wasn't behaving all that much better, and I thought, well, that's that. I guess it's not fixed. So I shut it down again. I decided to go ahead and shut it all the way down and power it back up. And ever since then, it's worked perfectly fine. So I think the kernel update that I received must have fixed the issue. That's my best guess, because the last update I had, there really wasn't anything graphically related. So I really think it was probably a kernel issue. Let's see which version of the kernel I'm on now. So I'm on 411.6-201 FC25 x86_64. So that's the theory anyway, but it kind of underscores why I don't like to blow things away in Linux. I like to be patient and give things a little time. I know people say, well, it's because you're on Fedora or it's because you're on Linux that you have these problems. If you were on Windows, you wouldn't have any problems. Well, I'm having a problem on Windows. I don't know if anybody's encountered the search problem with Windows, where you don't get any results, especially for doing a local search, say for Notepad. And I'll do a video on that as well, but right now I'm just focusing on Linux here today. So that's it. Everything seems to be working, knock on wood. I'm not saying it's going to continue working, but for right now, it seems to be good. And, in the meantime, when I was having the problem, it wasn't really that big of an issue for me. I've got my MacBook 2015, and I have my dual boot here on this system with Windows 10, and I know I've heard from a lot of you saying, hey, dual boot never works right, don't ever do dual boot. I'm confused about that. I really haven't had any problems whatsoever doing dual boot. Maybe with the UEFI BIOS, and I have a couple of videos on how to deal with that, so do a search for UEFI BIOS in my FastGadgets page on YouTube if you do run into a problem. And I do offer some fixes, at least for the Yoga 910. Your mileage may vary on other systems. So let's talk about the second topic. I'm looking at operating systems here, and I'm seeing that Linux looks like it went down a hair, maybe 0.1% to 1.99%. And Windows 10 here is hovering at 26.78, Windows 7 at 49.46%, and we have 8.1 at 6.7, and so on. We see Mac OS X 1012 at 3.5%. I'm wondering if there are some other Mac OS or OS 10 versions here and other that account for that, but overall, you can see which operating system gets the majority share. So looking at that, and this is something I see that is quite typical. So Microsoft has a tool that has EMET or EMET, depending on how you want to say it, capabilities that allows you to customize and granularize your security settings so that you can turn on various mitigations for certain applications. So if you're curious about the article, it's here on arstechnica.com by Peter Bright. Just came out on 6/27. And originally, Microsoft wasn't going to provide EMET built into Windows 10 because they felt like it would be a redundancy, and this was more of maybe perhaps a server product or something that you would want to see in server technologies to control your security and get kind of a centralized solution here where you could deploy mitigations based on your needs. Again, now this story really isn't about this tool, but basically it's the reaction of the community on Slashdot to the tool. So here comes this tool, and Microsoft saying, you know what, we are going to go ahead and put this in Windows 10, and it's possible it may help your system become more secure, but kind of like other tools, it may cause some problems with applications. And sure enough, there were a couple of people who reported that indeed, at a very large defense company, they pushed out EMET, and any third-party desktop applications had problems that utilized Java. Again, you're able to make setting changes, so I'm not sure why they wouldn't take account for that. Maybe that was just a problem with that particular deployment. Let's see. Some other people said it gets rid of Flash, which is a good thing. I have to agree. It causes problems with Chrome and other features, but what I'm really getting at here is those that respond specifically about how Linux is always the answer. So here's somebody who says this is a tool to harden Windows 10 against intrusions. Actually, they're asking, is there a tool? And the answer is yes, EMET, right? And this user responds, yes, it's called Linux. Wipe out Microsoft completely, including Microsoft Office, and install a solid distro such as Debian and LibreOffice. And this is always the response of some, not all, but some Linux users who think that Linux is, as far as the desktop environment, absolutely ironclad and not likely to cause any problems with malware or exploits, and that we're free to basically use the system in a desktop sense, in the desktop environment, without any fear of our system being compromised. Another user says, yeah, it's basically everything Microsoft. Here, this is totally hyperbole, but listen to this person. All the worms, ransomware, and malware that gets widespread exposure ends up loaded on millions of vectors. I love it. Is always Windows. It's not always Windows. We know that. Now, Android has problems. iOS to a lesser extent. Mac OS and OS 10 have some issues. There are a few Linux exploits out there. Certainly not as many, but if we go back and look at that percentage, would it be fair to say that the types of exploits, well, not type, but number of exploits is probably consistent with the percentage there? Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Windows 7 and 10, if you combine them, they're more than 75% of the users' desktop market. If we add Windows XP and 8.1, we're looking at about 85 to 90% with Windows 8. So about 85% are using Windows. It's fair to say, and we can expect that Windows is going to be the greatest target. So my whole thing is, if the Linux desktop market grew, and it would have to be an extensive growth factor, I don't think it would really matter if it grew 2 or 3 more percent, although Mac OS X is seeing more malware being developed for it and exploits than ever before. But it's only at about 3.5%, so I think we would have to see a considerable growth of 10 to 20%. Now, I don't very likely see that happening, but if users do get pushed based on privacy and they get pushed based on security concerns into the Linux realm, and the percentage actually did go up, I think it is safe to say from a security standpoint that there would be many more exploits, many more malware packages, many more vulnerabilities that are being detected, and there are many vulnerabilities that are detected in Linux already. We talked about in one of my previous videos about the Samba issue that was affecting Linux computers. So there was a vulnerability that was baked into Samba that was very, very old, and it was a 0-day exploit. So contrary to what this user's saying, always Windows, that's just not the case. Now, this person goes on to say, when was the last time you saw a remote root exploit for SSH? There were a couple of times, not necessarily remote root exploit, but there was at least 2 that I can think of that were SSH exploits that were concerning. One dealing with the key generation issue, and I think that was about 5 years ago. It was a while back, but it was an issue, and again, we did have to grab an update, so technically that was a 0-day exploit as well. And here, this user says, if Linux had the market share of all Windows versions, then we'd be seeing more exploits for Linux. As Willie Sutton allegedly said, it's where the money is. And that is basically the truth, although I don't know who Willie Sutton is, so forgive me if he's somebody popular. Any rate, yeah, I have to agree. The market share is where the attacks happen. Now, this is an interesting response here. So the Darkner says, given this statement, why haven't we seen widespread ransomware deployed to what the internet is essentially made of, Linux servers? I mean, that's where the real money is. Why go after petty consumers for $300 a pop when you could go after a ton of wealthy corporations that have real money at stake by losing millions of e-commerce dollars an hour running their businesses on Linux server farms? I think that answer actually is much more simpler than it appears on the surface. Businesses are engaged in the practice, or should be, many are, some aren't as well, in securing their enterprise and working towards securing their network and their systems. Individual users are not. So yes, maybe we only get $300 a pop on average for a petty consumer, but if you think of it this way, that user environment, a single user environment with somebody who is perhaps ignorant about security, and I'm not saying they're stupid, but I'm saying they're ignorant, and therefore their system is more likely to get hacked, and it's easier to make a certain chunk of change using some of this malware that's out there, and we basically hold that user's system hostage with ransomware until they pay up. And the people who are utilizing these exploits are not the high-level hackers that we're thinking that are trying to get billions of dollars from a company. And I'm not saying they're script kiddies either, but these are the average to above average hackers who maybe live in a third world country or in a country with an economy where $300 US currency equivalent would actually be a considerable amount of money. And if you multiplied that by 5 or 10, you now have what they call in the accounting industry a going concern, meaning, hey, I'm making pretty good money. I did $300 times 10. So I now have $3,000 to show for my work, and I just infected these computers, and I don't have to do anything. I sent out the malware, and the users get panicked because I'm holding their files ransom, so they pay me. And in some cases, some of this ransomware doesn't even do anything to encrypt the files, right? It just changes the location of them or whatever. Fairly simplistic, but the user is also simplistic when it comes to the security. So the bottom line here, why don't I want more users to go to Linux? Because as good as the Linux environment is, it's not exponentially better than Windows, and therefore, if we have a higher percentage of adoption for Linux desktop computers specifically is what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about Android or servers. Then unfortunately we are going to see an equivalent response from hackers saying, hey, I might be able to make some money doing this. But I think it would take quite a change. It really would be quite a while. We'd have to see a 20% uptick, in my opinion, before hackers would seriously begin to take notice, because Linux is a different animal. So if you're used to a tool set to develop malware or ransomware for Windows, then to migrate to a whole new platform would be a different type of software, more than likely, in a different way of generating the exploits. So basically that's my take on it. I'm glad that Linux is at 2%. It's security through obscurity. We're dodging some bullets because we don't have a large adoption. Yes, maybe Linux is marginally better than Windows systems with regard to security, but I really think the proof would be in the pudding if Linux had a major share, or if not major, significant. Then we would see how well it would basically stand up. And the answer to, well, why don't the servers get hacked all the time? That's because they're hardened. They're only running specific applications, usually web-based applications, and, well, really services. So there's very few services running. The attack vector is tiny. There's no desktop. It's running headless. And you can see, if you do a PS, just how many processes are running on a system when the graphical environment is running. If you look at a system without the graphical environment running, you have maybe 5 to 10 services running, and then those services that you choose, maybe a database service, perhaps a web server. So to me, it's pretty obvious why Linux servers don't get attacked. Well, they do get attacked, but they're not necessarily exploited that much. Now with Windows servers, some of the comments here, they're saying, who in their right mind would trust Windows servers? I have trusted Windows servers if they're properly hardened and you take into account only those services that you need and want to run and keep them updated and watch for security bulletins. I did not have any more exploits or compromises with my Windows servers running on the internet than I did with my Linux servers. So that's it for me. Really don't want to see more users on the desktop adopting Linux, because I like the security through obscurity and the lack of interest in compromising Linux. That works for me. Thank you as always for watching. If you really enjoyed watching Fast Gadgets, consider giving it a like and subscribing. And a big one for me is if you share. If you really enjoyed it, maybe drop $1 on my Patreon page monthly and buy me a cup of coffee. That is always really helpful. I'd like to raise a couple $100 a month using Patreon to go with the couple $100 I'm getting mostly on a regular basis from YouTube, and reduce my course intake that I am doing. So I teach college courses and see if I can't get more videos out for you. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time on Fast Gadgets.